Hello everybody, welcome to Mortal Lens. My name is Bryce. We've got these two Hasselblad lenses here, both 50mm f4. This one on the left has got a torn up shutter. You can see here a little preview. Nasty. They collided and chipped each other apart. Now the one on the right was dropped at some point and got a big old dent in the barrel here. But I'm hoping to maybe take the good parts out of this one and put them in the other one to have a nice copy. You can see it's just falling apart in my hands right here. But I'd hope to give some new life to these old vintage lenses. They're from the 70s. Now, before we get started, I just want to say thanks again for joining me on this journey. This is my first upload on the channel. Pretty excited. This is a hobby of mine for the last couple of years. And actually a bit of a time jump here. You can see all the parts on the right is from the donor lens. I just kind of did it backwards. Wanted to get a feel for how the video was going to go. But we'll end up moving all this stuff out of the way in just a second. So I'm using this little rubber cup. Got a couple of these in different sizes. That's to take this metal ring off. And this pretty much starts the whole journey here. So yeah, let's quickly move these out of the way. Much better. Much better. So now to get this main element out of there, there's a whole bunch of pieces of glass in this group. We'll use this, I guess, compass you can call it, to loosen it. And I like to take the end of that pointy bit and use it to unscrew that real quick. Makes quick work out of that. Now this is most of the lens. This piece here, you'll see in a second, it's a huge piece of glass, and pretty much all the lens is just in this front part of the barrel, which I think is pretty neat. And there it goes. Gives a nice little pop. So I'll use the rubber cup again to safely take that out without dropping it on the floor. It's pretty heavy. It's most of the weight of the whole lens is just in that piece. So you can see there it's all hollow, and you can actually see right down into the shutter at some point. Now there's these three little screws in there. That's all it holds on the barrel, is just these three little screws. So we'll get those taken off. So I've got a little electric screwdriver there. You can see off on the left of the screen. It's brand Hoto, which in another language I've been told is not a favorable nickname, if you will. But it's a great little screwdriver. It seizes up before you use it, which is a good thing because then you can torque the screws without it spinning around. And then the motor has a pretty good amount of torque. The bits are strong. I haven't broken one yet. And I really have beat the hell out of them. So far it's been great. And they're magnetic bits. You know, they magnet the screws so nothing falls off. So there you go. You can listen to that little motor go. And that about does it. That's the barrel of the lens. Most of the aesthetics from the outside has just been taken off. And I think it's kind of funny now. It looks just like an 80mm now, the 82.8. Which is a very sought after lens. Exceptional lens. I don't own one yet, but I will one day. And here we can take a close macro shot of those blades. Man, that's rough. So, not sure what happened here. I guess they just collided. And they actually should have shut right here. They should be shut right now. So, we'll take a look at that. And here, these three screws hold down the aperture and shutter selection wheels. And there's a fair amount of spring action in them, so I'm holding it down with my left hand so it doesn't come flying out across the room. You can see that I kind of grab it. So there you go. I can see I'll take all that off at once. Careful not to lose anything. Get those screws back in those holes. And this is the aperture ring here, the aperture selection. Now this little ball bearing here, tricky little guy. I usually like to take that out. It's in there pretty good, but I just like to take it out so it doesn't go flying. You'll never find that if that goes on the floor, in the carpet. Now next up is the spring that holds that in. And this one sure is under a lot of tension. So you gotta be careful not to lose it, as I did. No worries though, I found it. Just kidding, this is the one from the other lens. So, this is the donor spring. It was great to have that extra piece. But what this ball does is it gives the rings like a click, click, click. That's what gives you the settings on your exposure wheel when you're setting. And next up, we got 7 screws holding this housing in. I like to screw them out all the way, obviously, but leave them in the holes, in their respective holes, because they hold down springs and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's nice to keep them lined up for when you take it out. Anyway, once we get all 7 loosened up, pull the aperture preview button out of the way, and you give it a little bit of twist, a little bit of left, a little bit of right. It's kind of a pain, but there's a lot of stuff that it's got to get around. The main thing here is the shutter lever. That right there is for the shutter release, and that needs to go in the little track that's just below it. Although it didn't quite line up for me. Either way, give it enough encouragement and it'll get out of there. And there it goes. Just try and keep it upright so all those screws don't fall out. Next we got this little plate. Not really sure what it is, but it's there. Now here we're getting into the main stuff. This is the big stuff. So this ring here that I'm turning is the shutter selection. That's what couples to the ring on the outside, and that's how you select your shutter speed. And I fired it there just to see what was going on, because it didn't sound right. It shouldn't be making all that noise. And it turns out the shutter hadn't closed all the way, which was preventing it from being closed all the way. Here you can see they piled up. It's real bad. This is that clip from earlier in the video. Not a good situation. They should be fully open right now too. They should have closed. There we go. Okay. So it doesn't work very well at all. So at this point, we're going to take it off the camera. The camera is just there to give me a firm table to work on, and also to cock it easier. Because if you weren't aware, these old Hasselblad lenses have all the mechanism inside, which we'll find out now. And there I just fired it, just so that there's no built-up tension inside once I take this back plate off. So there's 8 screws on here. These are the bane of my existence. They're so small, and it just feels like you're unscrewing these forever. But once you do finally get them out, this is where paying attention to how things are lined up really comes into play. Because that screw there, right by my left thumb, that's what cocks the whole lens. And you can see there's a place for it to go underneath there. You want to make sure that that's lined up. You don't want to lose the alignment of that, or there's going to be problems in firing this little piece I'm pointing at here. You want to make note of how that's oriented as we move further. So now let's get the rear element out. And this is all the glass, this last piece. This is all the glass of the whole lens. It's kind of fun if you hold the 2 pieces up, the 2 groups, you can actually see through, and it functions just like a normal 50mm. That's it. It's just these 2 sections. Now we can work on getting the focus apparatus out of there. It's just got 4 screws. These are real easy screws. They're not too bad. And that gear I was talking about earlier, that's just there on the left that you need to pay attention to, that's not attached to this, but in my case it is, just because the grease is kind of holding it in. You need to make sure of that position. Next up, we've got this plate, which holds kind of the aperture mechanism. It holds that gear that drives most of the lens, and this just has 3 real easy screws here. Just pull these out. Exposing the depth of field indicator mechanism. This is a pretty cool little mechanism. So you'll see here in a moment just how it works. But let's first take out the screw. This is like the main driving screw. This is what cocks the whole lens. Excuse me. Now these 2 gears here work together to show the depth of field indicator on top of the lens. It's a variable depth of field indicator. It shows you essentially your depth of field at a given aperture. Now we'll see later, I suppose, how that works. At the moment I've taken it apart But here's one of the rings. It's got a little red tip on it. And we'll set that aside. We'll come back to that in a second. But first, we'll take the spring off and this little spacer. As far as I know, this is just a spacer, this brass piece. That's just to keep the depth of field indicators separated. Now, next up is this spring. It's not under a whole lot of tension, but it can go flying if you let go of it. Which thankfully mine just fell down. Now lastly is the second depth of field indicator, and I'll show you here. I like to just stack them kind of how they are situated in the lens, so I put that one on the bottom and put the other one on top of it, just so that I don't mix them up. You shouldn't be able to, but it's just nice. That about does it. Now we can manually use the aperture blades, which is kind of neat to see how that works. Next up is the big part. We're actually going to be taking the mechanism out of this shell. There's 6 screws in here, kind of like lug nuts that hold that in. And these are also a pain. They're real tight. They're real small, you know. And mine was really stuck in there for some reason, so I had to pry it out of there. And either way, there it is. This is the whole mechanism of the lens. This controls the shutter. This controls the aperture, the self-timer, all that stuff. So let's move these screws out of the way so I don't lose them. And flipped it over, and now we've got these springs that keep tension on the shutter. That one was for the shutter, and this next one's for the aperture. They just have little places for them to sit, and that keeps those rings tight. Speaking of the aperture ring, no, we're going to flip it over. So I'm going to take this little lock out of here, this little lock ring that holds the shutter plate. I basically did this because it has that little notch that sticks up, and I didn't want it to bend. Here we get our first look of the mechanism. Now, before we get going, I do like to mark these gears. Looks like someone's been in here before, but I just like to have my own mark just to make sure these are lined up properly when we go back later and put it together. You can see there. After we've done that, we're free to take these out. That has a little pinion on it, and this one's just a gear, just a cog. But after we've got that, we can take this main, I don't know what you want to call it, kind of a hook plate with gear teeth, whatever you want to call it. And it's got a spring on it. Just be careful not to lose that one. Now flipping it over, we're going to finally take the aperture ring, control ring off of there. It's got these 3 screws. One of the screws has kind of a little clip on it. It's a little bit taller, and it's got a place for that spring to sit. And just make note of which one that is. They may have different threads, I'm not sure, but it's just good to know which location it goes in. Now these screws, they tighten all the way, but they don't actually hold the aperture ring down. It just keeps it from coming out, which I think is pretty neat. It's crazy how that small of a tolerance exists in this lens. I mean, these tolerances are so small that I kind of understand how it works, but I could have never designed it. It's incredible. The next up is a copper screw. This is what holds your self-timer switch in, similar to the other one, but there's just one screw for this. Now taking that out, we do need to be careful of, there's a peg that sticks down. You can kind of see it there when I'm pointing at. I'll show you later on how that gets lined up. You got to make sure it's in the right spot. But either way, we're ready to start taking this case off. Now this will finally expose those shutter blades so we can really take a look at those. It's just these 5 screws around here. And it's really important to keep this flat at this point in time, because if you are to tip it, I suppose it's not a big deal, but all the shutter blades will fall out. And if it's your first time, it's really good to have a reference of how they're supposed to be sat in there. And you can see I'm assessing that other piece on the right for damage. There is a scratch in there, but I don't think it'll be a problem. But there you go. These are the 5 shutter blades. These are what move real fast or real slow. Well, either way, even if it's a slow shutter, they still are moving incredibly fast just to get to that timer. So we'll take those out, and here you can get a close look of that little chip. These are made of titanium. They're pretty strong, but they're very thin. And here are the new ones that I've taken out of the donor lens, just giving them a little wipe down. They had a bit of oil on them and fingerprints from me. Now here's the important part. You want to make note of this. There's a little bend on the tip of this shutter leaf. That is very important. This needs to be the first one that you put down. And you can see these pegs. This one doesn't have a hole in it, and this one does. You want to start in the one that's immediately counterclockwise of the full one after putting this plate on there. And again, making sure that tip is down, is bent down. This just ensures that they don't collide like they had done. And then the next three, they're flat. You just go counterclockwise, being sure to stack them on top of each other. And the last one we'll see has a different bend going up. These blades, they're razor sharp, so it's not surprising that they can tear themselves apart that easily. It's like a knife through paper almost. And here you can see that tab facing up. We'll put that one at the very end. And there we are. Let's give it a quick little rudimentary test here, and you can see nothing's colliding. That's great. And we can put the lid back on. Now, there's a little slot. You can see where my left middle finger is. I'm holding down this little lever, and just to like the top right of that is a hole. Right where my finger was. That's where we want that little lever to slide into. You may be able to catch it. You can see just to the right of my left index finger. There you go. As you can see it sliding through right there. A little hard to see, but that is the control for the shutter. Now I like to get at least 1 or 2 screws in here just to make sure, as I mentioned before, if you were to tip it, all those blades would fall out and you'd have to restart. So just getting those 2 tightened down. There is a procedure that has to go on after this with all these little springs from the other end of this, all the mechanism. We'll get into that in a second. I just wanted to make sure that this is tight, and once again confirm operation. Everything's working real smooth. Nothing's colliding. Great news. So let's flip it over. Here's those little springs I was talking about. We'll start with this one over here. So there's a lever, little arm, and that needs this end of the spring. Let's see if I can fish this out of here. There we go. Oh, there we go. So once that hooks around, and it's a little hard to see, it's out of focus, but the right side of the spring has a place in that arm to sit, and the left side has this scratch along the outside of the barrel. It was put in there during manufacturing, and you can see it working just fine. You can see a little bit better that scratch there on the left. Now moving on a little bit clockwise is this spring. This is a pretty easy one. You just got to kind of push it down just like that, and it'll sit as is. All good. This one, a little bit tighter. I had the wrong technique going in. I tried to do it like the one before, where you just kind of push it in, but it needs to go pretty far down. It's bent up pretty good. So just by grabbing it like this, pulling it down, work like a charm. And you just want to make sure it's sitting in its slot just fine. No problems there. And lastly, we want to check on this connector here. This should be moving freely. It should be able to lever, to work on as a lever, grabbing that little connection there. And there we go. That's everything. So those just got pushed out of the way when we put the housing over it. Next up, we can put the last 3 screws in here and tighten them all down, and then that's pretty much it for the mechanism. It's all put in there. The shutter blades are working just fine. Excellent news. And there you go, just to confirm once more. It's amazing. Next up, here's that little thing I was talking about earlier. This is your self-timer switch. It needs to go on the right side of that little spring. That works better if you flip it over and watch from that side. Now it's going to be the left side. So that little peg just needs to go up in there. You can see it kind of barely just sticking its way up. There we go. And you get that copper screw back in there to hold it down. Kind of interesting to me that only one screw is needed for this. However, the aperture ring will hold the rest of it down. It's just maybe a temporary one, just to keep it for the time being. There you can see in the bottom left it moving back and forth, interacting with that piece of spring. And here's the aperture ring. You just want to slide it around a little bit until the peg falls into that hole, in which case it is now coupled. Kind of weird because from the other side it looks like it's just 5 regular blades, but from this side you can see something a little more special is going on. Very interesting design. Now these 3 screws can go in, keeping note of that tower screw here that I'm screwing in now. That will have the spring attached to it, as you can see here. So one end of it goes onto the shutter ring itself, and the other end goes onto that tower screw. Similar story for the shutter spring. This has a tower. We didn't ever touch this one. That one just stays at the top there and couples with that lever that we were looking at earlier. It's got a little notch for it. Make sure it sits in there. You can see I kind of push it off and then back on, just like that. Next up, let's get this thing in here, in the main housing. So, make note of this little red connector. It has a corresponding piece on the inside there. Those need to be lined up, and once those are lined up, you know it's in the right spot. But before you do that, you got to slide the little self-timer lever into its slot. Drop it down. If you're lucky, it'll go right in. As we see here. Beautiful. Little pop, and it's in. In which case, we can flip it over and get those 6 screws in there. My favorite screws. This really stumped me the first time I worked on this kind of lens, because these 6 screws are kind of hard to find. You know, this is what takes apart the whole mechanism, and they're kind of hidden in there. They're also very easy to strip. Don't ask me how I know that. So we'll get those tightened down. Want to make sure they're real tight, kind of wiggle the mechanism back and forth. You want to make sure that we're not having any seating problems. Next up, we can get this gear in. We're almost there. So this is connected essentially directly to the cocking mechanism on the back through this gear here. And this gear couples with another one, which couples to the driving action. Now let's get these depth of field indicators in. We'll see a little bit more here how they work. So this one slots in on the left, on the right, excuse me. Slides back and forth. Then we can drop the little gears in here. Oh, yeah, oh, there we go. We want that up. Oh, okay. Well, forget the tweezers. We're going with the pliers. There it is. So this couples with the bottom ring as well as this gear. This gear does not couple with the bottom ring, but rather the top gear. The top ring, excuse me. First, we need to put the spacer in. That looks just like that. Kind of goes a little bit clockwise to the aperture control arm. Let's put that little spring in there. This took way longer than I'm willing to admit, this little spring. I just didn't have a good grip on it. So that attaches to this little pillar right there. Perfect. And you want to make sure it's on the outside of that spacer, not on the top, because that's where the other depth of field ring sits. Yep, just confirming. And as mentioned, the second depth of field ring. This couples with that gear, as well as the aperture control, as well as slotting into that slot on the outside. So just spin that around until you get the little peg on the long end of that. You can see it sitting in there now. And I want to confirm that these are synced together. They're not. So to do that, I like to hold one down while lifting the other one up and just move it one tooth away. And there you go. Now they're synced up. You can see they're both in the middle at the same time. We'll see that in a second. A little bit closer. And there you go. A little quick clip there. Next up is this plate. You want to make sure it interfaces well with the aperture peg as well as that gear on the top left right there. Once those are situated, give it a little tight down. Now here I tightened these down too soon. There was a bit of interference with that ring. You can see here I try and move it and it's not budging. So it was getting bound on something, not quite sure what it was doing. All I had to do was loosen those 3 screws, give it a nudge, and tighten it back down once I confirmed it was moving. And there you go. There's the whole thing. They don't move in a linear fashion, which is pretty interesting. So now let's just confirm the aperture preview button is working. You want to make sure when you push that down that it kind of pulls the aperture ring back a little bit. Once we know that's working properly, we can work on the gear train, getting this one back in there, making sure to line up those marks we made earlier. Now, even if it's one tooth off, we know it's not going to cock properly. Now this spring attaches to that little peg that we were looking at earlier. Just want to make sure that's on there. Then give it a little twist. It's a little awkward trying to manipulate all this stuff at once. You got to make sure the spring stays on. You want to make sure it's spun the right way, staying on the track, make sure the gears mesh properly, all this stuff. There's a whole lot going on here. So it'd be nice to have a third hand, but somehow got it all working first try. And then there's 2 other things you want to do. You want to make sure this peg is on that end of the gear, as well as the aperture ring has a little tooth that you want to make sure is above the bottom of that ring that we just put in. You can see there it's able to slide back and forth. Now, I lost some footage here. I'm not sure what happened. So this is video from earlier from the disassembly in reverse. So I wouldn't flip it over at that point because you would lose those gears, they'd fall out. So I actually put the shutter ring back in as well as that clip and then tighten these up. Again, making sure that that gear is in the same spot it was when I took it apart. That way everything is in the right sequence. Now we're going to put the rear element in here. This is actually going to be the one of 2 times I end up putting in it just because of the miscontinuity here. But either way, just wanted to show that to you guys. Give that a little tighten down. Here's this piece. I'm not sure what this is. I remember the first time I took my lens apart, that just fell out. And here you go. I promise you it's not that easy to put that plate in. It's just because it's in reverse that it happens to look great. Either way, we'll tighten these 8 screws down, and at this point we can actually put it back on the lens since everything is put together on the back end. So you can see here there's that shutter plate put in, as I mentioned. That's the only other step that I was able to miss. You just want to make sure that everything's lined up properly. Now, here's my favorite part of the lens. I actually had to re-record this part because I was saying I had missed some footage. So this is my second attempt of doing this, of course. So once again, line up that shutter little knob with that hole. And after doing this a couple times, I've gotten pretty good at it. You give it a little twist clockwise, push it down, give it a little twist counterclockwise, and then a little twist clockwise, and it sits right in. It was perfect. All those screws, like I mentioned earlier, are right where they need to be. All the springs are oriented the right way, and you just want to make sure this aperture preview button is on that post. as well as the spring for it. The little spring steel needs to be sort of flat. It was poked up a little bit since it was pushed down. And there you go. That's working perfect. Now we can tighten these 7 screws, the worst screws, because the screwdriver tip is going to slide off of it slightly, which then there's not enough clearance for you to actually tighten it. So then you got to make sure that screwdriver is on there just right. These slotted screws are a pain, but much harder to strip than Phillips, I suppose. Anyway, we can put this little ball bearing back in there, being sure not to drop it. You see it's magnetized to my pliers there. Goes in that little slot where we put the new spring. And, oh, dropped it in there, of course. There we are. Has a little pop. Nice little pop. And just because I can't help myself, we're going to make sure that's working good. Anyway, next up, we got to locate the aperture ring as well as the shutter ring. Taking this plate out, be sure not to drop the screws. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Who'd have guessed? Anyway, the aperture ring is down there, the control ring. You want to find that. You can see I try to turn it here. Just trying to show you where it's at. There you go. Here it spring back. So the selector ring has a little notch for it. You can drop that in. Make sure it interfaces well. And make sure it also clears the shutter ring on the opposite end. You want to make sure that that's over top of it. Just like that. Next up, the shutter selection ring. Has its own notch. I didn't show you there, but it's very similar to the aperture one. And once that's on, make sure it's all running good. Just drop it anywhere, and you can put this ring. Watching out for this little kind of sunken area. That's where the little ball bearing goes. It sits in that area once you flip it over. Now we can drop these screws into the countersunk holes, not the other holes. Those holes are used for the lens barrel later on. But let's get these 3 in there. Being sure to keep tension. You can see my hands all contorted, weirdly. So I'm trying to keep a lot of tension on that, just so it doesn't fly out and shoot these screws across my room. And once you get 2, you can probably feel comfortable, you know, letting go of it. But either way, I'm going to use the electric screwdriver for those, because why not? And make sure everything's working good. Hold down the aperture ring and make sure they slide against each other fine. And again, that ball bearing is what's allowing that detent to give you those definite selections. Now let's get the front group and the barrel lined up. You want to check for the words. You want that on the top of the lens. Now looking straight at the lens here, that's the top, not the front. That would be the top. Make sure those are lined up there, and just these 3 screws. I've seen some are not black. I'm not sure if it's a manufacturing year difference. I know the donor lens that I had silver screws, which is interesting. There were a few differences, but nothing major. So now we can drop this big group in there. You can see we've zoomed out. We're getting on the home stretch here. We'll use that end of the compass to get that tightened in there real quick. At least hand tight. And now we can get the rear element in there for the second time. And using this tip of the compass really just, I mean, look how quick that is. It's awesome. Super cheap compass. I think I got it on eBay, but it works great. It's got this pointy side, which is great for this one. It's got the 2 holes in it. That works good. And the other side is kind of like a screwdriver, which is great for this front element. It's got the notches in it. And once that's tight, we just got one more piece. This metal ring, and yes, it is metal, basically serves as the plaque, if you will. Information telling you what kind of lens it is, serial number, and sort of a dust shield too, because there's a gap there. Yeah, let's use these rubber cups. I got, I don't know, 10 sizes here. It's great. This bigger one is just big enough to work for this. But that about does it. I think we did a pretty good job here. I hope you guys learned something at least useful in this. This is a great little journey. And this is my equipment, so, you know, I'm not wearing gloves. You probably noticed fingerprints all over everything throughout the whole video, but it doesn't bother me. Everything works, that's all that matters. It's a little bit scratched up on the outside, but still a great lens. It's what's on the inside, you know? So, let's get this mounted on the camera. First, we gotta cock it. We got this tool here. It's basically a screwdriver with a little shield on it. A little special tool. One of the only specialty tools that I own. And there we go. Once again, thank you guys for joining me. I may have a few more, you know, jobs up my sleeve. We'll see how that goes. A couple more Hasselblad stuff, maybe some Nikon stuff. But just testing here how the shutter speeds sound. I'll put it at a 1/4 and 1/2. I don't have a timer, but sounds good to me. So yeah, that's great. We'll put it together. Why not? A little celebratory. Let me know what else you guys want. If you have anything in particular, I can certainly look for something. But until then, appreciate you guys doing this journey with me. So you just fire it one more time. Awesome. All right, folks. Until the next one, I think this about does it. So stay safe, and see you then.